The UK economy is on track to be the worst performing of any G7 nation this year. The International Monetary Fund has predicted a contraction of 0.3%, worse than France, Italy, Germany, even Russia.
The alarm bells rang across London before sunrise, but it wasn't the sound that terrified the UK. It was the silence coming from Africa. No shipments, no trade confirmations, no diplomatic explanations. Overnight, Africa had pulled away, and the UK was caught completely unprepared. A nation that once believed it could predict every global shift suddenly faced the one scenario it never imagined: Africa stepping out of its shadow and standing tall on its own terms.
The UK is now the second most depressing country to live in officially. Taxes are at a post-war record high, up to 45% income tax on what you earn, then 20% VAT tax on what you spend. If you're a business, you have VAT, then 25% corporation tax, then business rates, then 15% national insurance. Then you've got council tax, road tax, car tax, stamp duty tax. There are
Prices in the UK surged within hours, markets froze, investors fled, and as the pound tumbled to historic lows, the truth became painfully clear. The UK had underestimated the very continent that powered its industrial heart for generations. Africa, unified and economically ascendant, was no longer waiting for permission to lead. It was choosing its own partners, forging its own alliances, charting its own future. And the UK? For the first time in modern history, it wasn't setting the rules.
Sugar, flour, bread, those are basic food. Eggs, you can't buy eggs. Even lime, you could have get a 50p lime, now it's £1. Everything is going up. Clothes and things, they're not going up because you don't need clothes, but you need food. Wages doesn't go up. In the COVID time, I put my life on the line to save other people. But yet still, I get no.
It was scrambling to keep up. What stunned the world wasn't Africa's independence, it was the UK's panic. Because the shift London feared, dismissed and ignored for decades had finally arrived. Africa wasn't breaking away in anger. It was rising in power. And nothing in Europe was ready for that.
When this collapse comes, and it's going to come, we in the UK are going to need to have some serious reflection on mistakes that have been made, and especially our foreign policy in history. And we're going to have to rely on these nations that we've been stealing from for years to deal with us, because we need them.
The most dangerous situation is in Africa, because of course Africa is absolutely the most important continent on the planet. The most important continent to the planet. And the next most important, and therefore the next most at-risk region, is the Middle East. The Middle East and Africa power the whole global economy. They power everything that makes so-called modern life possible. It's all made possible by the Middle East and Africa. And if the West was an actually civilized...
The warning signs had been there for years, but the United Kingdom never took them seriously. Officials in London dismissed the early shifts in African trade policy as symbolic, believing they would fade once negotiations resumed. But the world had changed, and Africa had changed most of all. What the UK considered symbolic was in fact the beginning of a continental strategy decades in the making. When the announcement finally came, it hit with the force of a storm. Africa was pulling away, restructuring its economic ties, and the UK was no longer on the priority list. The shock swept through Westminster like a cold wind. Overnight reports showed that Africa had drastically cut its export flow of key resources to the UK: metals, agricultural products, energy materials, and industrial inputs the British economy depended on. Trade routes that had existed for generations now rerouted to Asia, the Middle East, and within Africa itself. The UK was not singled out, but it was noticeably sidelined, and the markets reacted instantly. In London's financial district, traders stared at screens in disbelief. Commodity prices surged, manufacturing stocks plummeted, analysts struggled to explain what had happened. For decades, the UK had assumed that its historical connections to Africa guaranteed preferential access. But Africa's new trade framework did not care for old assumptions. It rewarded fairness, value, and partnership, not legacy. Across African capitals, the mood was entirely different. Leaders celebrated the continent's new economic direction. After years of watching their resources shape distant wealth, they were finally building a system that prioritized African development. Trade within Africa increased, new processing plants replaced raw material pipelines, and investments flowed into local industries instead of foreign corporations. Africa was rising loudly, boldly, and unapologetically. Meanwhile, the UK found itself facing a crisis it had not prepared for. Manufacturing centers from Birmingham to Manchester struggled to secure raw materials for production. The automotive sector reported delays. Energy companies warned of increased costs. Even supermarkets felt the strain as imported goods from Africa arrived in reduced quantities. The country had long underestimated how deeply intertwined it was with African supply chains. Government officials appeared on television reassuring the public that the situation was temporary, that strong ties would soon be restored, but behind closed doors, the tone was much darker. Internal documents admitted that alternative suppliers would take years to establish. Even worse, Africa now controlled the pricing power, and the UK had little leverage to influence costs. Westminster expected African nations to bend once negotiations began, but negotiations didn't begin at all. Africa stood firm. The decision wasn't born from anger, it was born from empowerment. The continent had new partners, new alliances, and new leverage. China, India, Brazil, Turkey, and Gulf nations had invested heavily in African infrastructure and manufacturing. Europe's influence had weakened. The UK's influence had evaporated. In Nairobi, reporters spoke proudly of Africa's new trading independence. In Lagos, economists discussed how Africa was reshaping global supply chains. In Johannesburg, investors celebrated the growth of local industries that once struggled under the shadow of foreign dominance. The transformation was real and irreversible. But in the UK, panic turned into political tension. Parties blamed one another for ignoring Africa's strategic rise. Critics warned that Britain had spent too long focusing on European politics and not enough on the rapidly shifting global south. The public demanded answers. How could a nation that once positioned itself as a global powerhouse be caught unprepared by such a predictable shift? One British newspaper headline captured the fear spreading across the country. Africa pulls away, UK faces economic freefall. The phrase wasn't an exaggeration. The pound fell sharply. Investors withdrew from uncertain sectors. Factories cut working hours. Everything depended on a return to stable trade with Africa, a return Africa wasn't rushing toward. In African cities, the narrative was entirely different. People celebrated that their countries were finally valuing their own resources instead of exporting them cheaply. For decades, minerals were extracted from African soil, shipped abroad, refined elsewhere, and then sold back to Africa at exorbitant prices. Those days were ending. Africa was processing its own metals, manufacturing its own goods, and controlling its own economic destiny. What unsettled the UK most was the unity Africa displayed. Historically, economic powerhouses benefited from divisions between African countries, but now Africa was coordinating as a continent, moving as one force, negotiating as a single market. It was an economic revolution unfolding in real time, and the UK was not prepared to navigate it. As winter approached, energy companies issued emergency bulletins, reduced access to African materials meant renewable energy projects slowed down, increasing reliance on costly alternatives. Transportation companies struggled with shortages. Even the tech sector, which relied heavily on African minerals, warned that future innovation could be compromised. The crisis wasn't temporary, it was systemic. Yet Africa showed no signs of reversing course. Infrastructure projects expanded, inter-African trade grew stronger, and global interest poured into the continent. Africa had something the world could not replace: the resources, the land, the youth, and the future. And for the first time, the UK realized it was not in a position of negotiation, it was in a position of need. The collapse the UK never expected was no longer a forecast, it had already begun. The tension inside the UK grew heavier with every passing hour, spreading from government offices to the living rooms of ordinary citizens who suddenly found themselves trapped in an economic storm they did not understand. News anchors repeated the same alarming phrases: supply freeze, currency shock, Africa realignment, until the words felt like a national drumbeat of fear. Yet behind the chaotic headlines, a deeper truth was emerging. The UK had never expected Africa to act with such unity, precision, and long-term strategy. Africa's decision to reorient trade partnerships away from London was not a spontaneous gesture. It had roots ignored for years by foreign policies that assumed Africa would always remain dependent. But now the entire continent was demonstrating something far more powerful, independence backed by economic leverage. What shocked the UK most was not the policy shift, but the speed and coordination behind it. Countries across Africa, once viewed individually, now acted as a single economic force, amplifying their influence in a way Britain had never prepared for. Inside Parliament, a storm of debates erupted. Some officials insisted on emergency negotiations, believing that a quick diplomatic mission could reverse the damage. Others argued that the UK should respond with sanctions, confident that Africa would retreat under pressure. But these arguments did nothing to change the reality outside. The immediate impact was already spreading across the country like a cold front. Ports along the UK coast sat quiet, waiting for shipments that did not arrive. Containers filled with critical minerals, agricultural produce, and manufacturing inputs were halted at African export hubs, not out of hostility, but because Africa was prioritizing its new trade corridors with Asia, South America, and even strategic partners within its own continental alliances. The UK, once at the front of the line, was now moved dramatically toward the back. The first sector to feel the blow was manufacturing. British factories, many dependent on African raw materials, slowed to a crawl. Car assembly lines paused 4 days at a time. Chemical plants rationed their production schedules. Electronics companies warned that without immediate imports, they would face prolonged closures. Suddenly, the UK understood how deeply its economy relied on Africa's resources it had taken for granted. But the shockwave did not stop there. The British pound, already fragile from years of economic volatility, reacted violently to the news. Investors pulled out, fearing long-term instability. The currency fell 2 levels that analysts had previously described as theoretical worst-case scenarios. Families who had booked travel abroad found their costs doubling overnight. Imported goods became luxuries rather than necessities. Even the price of energy, already a national concern, crept higher, pushed by disruptions in global markets responding to Africa's realignment. Meanwhile, Africa seemed calm, almost methodical. Government spokespeople across the continent gave composed statements explaining that their decisions were not retaliation, but rebalancing, an effort to prioritize regions that offered mutual growth rather than extractive relationships. Africa's tone was firm but not hostile. This only deepened the UK's anxiety. It realized this shift was not negotiable, not temporary, and not emotional. It was strategic. Across African capitals, new bilateral agreements were signed at record speed. Countries from East Africa formed energy partnerships with South Asia. West Africa launched joint ventures with South America in agriculture and technology. Southern Africa expanded its trade routes through modernized ports built with international collaboration. Africa was not isolating itself, far from it. It was simply choosing to direct its economic power toward partners that treated it as an equal. Inside UK corporate offices, executives scrambled to understand what was happening. They held emergency meetings late into the night, reviewing supply charts, profit forecasts, and risk assessments that now looked dangerously outdated. For years, companies had relied on predictable flows of African goods, confident that the relationship would remain unchanged. Now they were forced to confront a new reality. Africa no longer needed the UK's markets to thrive. In fact, the UK needed Africa far more than Africa needed the UK. The British public, sensing the shift, grew increasingly restless. Social media filled with questions, theories, and frustration. Citizens demanded answers from their leaders. How had this been allowed to happen? Why had no one anticipated Africa's economic rise? Why had the UK maintained policies built on assumptions from another era? The questions piled up faster than officials could respond. In truth, the warning signs had been there for years. Analysts had pointed out Africa's rapid industrial growth, its surge of infrastructure development, its advances in digital innovation, and its deepening partnerships with Asian powers. The UK had watched these developments from afar, rarely adjusting its policies, assuming that Africa's transformation would be slow and fragmented. That assumption now looked dangerously naive. Behind closed doors, UK intelligence reports painted an even clearer picture. Africa had spent years quietly building the capacity to reduce dependency on old colonial economies. New trade blocs, manufacturing zones, and transportation corridors had been forming under the global radar. While the UK debated domestic politics, Africa was building the foundations of economic independence. And now those foundations were strong enough to shift global trade patterns in a matter of days. The most alarming realization came when British economists calculated the long-term effect. If Africa continued redirecting exports at the current rate, the UK would face a multi-year economic contraction, not a temporary decline, but a structural downturn, something that could reshape the nation's economic identity. In a quiet moment in one government office, an advisor stared at a report summarizing the crisis. At the bottom of the page, one sentence was underlined: "The UK took Africa's partnership for granted. Africa did not." Those words carried more weight than any official statement. They were a reflection of history, one that had finally caught up with Britain. Outside, as the UK braced for the full impact of Africa's withdrawal, Africa itself stood confidently on the global stage. With new alliances, stronger negotiation power, and control over critical resources, the continent was no longer reacting to global events, it was shaping them. And for the first time in modern memory, the UK found itself on the receiving end of a shift it never believed possible.